Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. Hope that you had a nice weekend. This week, we are scheduled to cover the legacies of colonialism and slavery, and we will get to that. We're going to finish up our lecture on trajectories of development and political institutions. We'll talk about some other types of institutions that fell under the extractive category, and we'll also discuss settler colonies as well. And we'll take a look at how they differed from the extractive colonies. So our objective today is to take a look at some data and look at the differences between the types of colonies in their development, but also to think about some of the questions involved whenever we attribute development in the present to events that really took place hundreds of years ago in many cases. So we'll be continuing this discussion of historical legacies, and specifically by focusing on political institutions. You'll notice, though, that we'll begin to talk about some of those legacies of colonialism that we'll address more directly on Wednesday and Friday. So thank you, everyone, for being here. It's good to see you. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and continue. So as you know, we've been discussing settler colonies and extraction colonies, and we've been doing this as an exercise in differentiating between different kinds of institutions. Inclusive institutions or developmental ones are the ones that are associated with the settler colonies, and the extractive or bad ones, the ones that tend to ignore interests, concentrate power, etc., are associated with the extractive colonies. And Latin America is one of the better examples of a former extractive colony, or what we would refer to as an extraction colony. And so far, we've discussed viceroys or viceroys. Viceroys were essentially vice kings. Remember that the Latin American countries, or the present day Latin American countries, were basically like sub-royalties, and the crown duplicated its absolute authority in these territories by setting up viceroys and viceroyalties who would rule absolutely and who would exercise the same kind of royal control that the crown did back home in Spain. The viceroys created the foundation for the political system, which was absolutist and authoritarian and not democratic in the slightest. That political system held up by the viceroys was further sort of embellished by political economic institutions that would also reproduce the authority of the crown and really the state. And one of those was the encomienda. It was from the Spanish verb to entrust or encomendar. And the encomienda basically gave Spaniards trusteeship over indigenous laborers in a given area. In the Latin American countries, just a minute, everyone. My cat is misbehaving. I've got to take care of this. Come on. Hang out with me. Okay. Will you be good? Be good. Okay. So Latin American countries were filled with indigenous people, and these often were very stratified societies to begin with. And the encomienda basically extended control over indigenous laborers in a given area to specific Spaniards who would be entrusted to do this and kind of empowered by the crown. And the key feature of the encomienda was that the landowner, or the Spaniard who controlled the laborers, did not own the laborers and did not even actually own the land. Legally, these were subjects of the crown. And the absolute control that I discussed in conjunction with the viceroyalties really reproduced itself here, because the Spaniards who were entrusted to control the laborers neither owned them nor possessed or retained control of the land when they passed away, at which point the encomienda would revert to the crown. And this system working from home is very, very difficult. I'm sorry, that should be the last interruption. This system gave the crown substantial authority, and it only provided a kind of superficial control to those Spaniards who were entrusted to retain influence over the indigenous. And these were different than those systems in feudal Europe, where landowners actually owned the land, and estates would revolve around the passage of ownership from one generation to another. The situation was different because when the Spaniard who was entrusted to oversee the indigenous in that area passed away, there was no inheritance. The ownership would revert to the crown. And so there was never actually any real ownership to the extent that we understand it as being assets that belong to individual or private actors. In this case, the absolute control exercised by the crown was filtered down through the economic institutions. And the encomienda was one key example. And the death of the encomendero signified the continued control of the state, because at that point, the assets would return to the control of the crown. And this would help to prevent the encomienda from becoming an estate and from consolidating and generating family wealth and sustaining that over a period of centuries. And so Latin American countries of today were very, very different at that point in time as compared to, say, old Europe, where estates and asset ownership and control were features that didn't come from the crown. They were things that were actually real. People or families could own assets, and estates did exist. Now, granted, there was a significant degree of concentration of wealth, but it was different than, say, the encomienda system, where the state controlled everything. Karen, this was the Spanish. The Spanish crown set up these encomiendas. They colonized the Americas, and so, or at least present day Latin America. So it wasn't an agreement with other countries. They took possession of those areas, and so for all intents and purposes, they made those decisions. And so what we're discussing is we're talking about what the colonizers set up when they took possession of these places, what kinds of institutions they set up. And so in this case, the Spaniards set up the encomiendas. To the extent that there was a decision-making process, there was a role for the church as well, the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church would teach the indigenous and try to convert them, at the same time that the Spanish crown would entrust to Spaniards control of the encomienda. And so there was coordination between the church and the state, but these encomiendas were a product of the Spanish Empire in their effort to set up institutions that they could use to extract as much wealth and precious resources as they could from the colonies. But these institutions, as you can already begin to see, set up an arrangement in a framework that concentrated power and authority and really provided no private ownership or no basis for private investment or initiative whatsoever. And what we'll eventually get to is how these institution foundations, these institution creations, set in motion maybe a path or a trajectory of development that was difficult to break. That, at least, is the intuition in the institutional models of development that we've been reading about and discussing. This is a picture, or I guess a lithograph technically, of indigenous working in their villages, and then Spaniards entrusted by the crown supervising and controlling their activities. I don't know if the Catholic Church is represented in this image, but you can clearly see that there is a stratification and a social stratification in that labor is performed by the indigenous who are effectively enslaved. Um, and there's a whole set of religious and social institutions that went along with these political and economic ones, but we're only scratching the surface so that we can kind of get a sense, and we'll do the best we can to incorporate these ideas as we go along. Now, the encomiendas were eventually abolished, but they gave rise to new arrangements, and the mercantile or the mercantilism arrangements or the mercantilist policies that became the focus of the Spanish Empire really largely replaced them. And this is an economic theory that stresses developing trade between a colonizer and its colonies. In this situation, institutions are arranged to promote wealth based on extracting natural resources. And this setup is basically intended to prevent competition from other colonizing states. All of the action is between Spain and Latin America. Mercantilism was basically designed to accumulate as much precious wealth as possible through arrangements that would channel those resources back to the mother country and exclude other countries from participating in markets in that colony or that place. All of the action is between Spain and Latin America, or in the case of specific colonies, say Bolivia in Latin America, or Venezuela in Spain, I should say, for example. The idea is that Spain needs enough labor and it needs enough precious minerals to basically support its empire building and fuel the expansion of its military, consumption back home, and really finance its continued imperialism. This mercantilist policy is the policy pursued by most European colonizers, with the exception of Britain, where most of the colonies set up by Britain were settler colonies. But the mercantilist policies were much more associated with the extraction colonies. And the mercantilist system basically left intact all of those absolutist political institutions, and then layered on top of them these economic policies that excluded other countries and that set up basically channels between the colony and the mother country. And mercantilism relied a lot on this promotion of self-sufficiency and short-run consumption purely for the benefit of Spain. There was no reinvestment of revenues or profits or income in Latin America. That benefit went back to Spain. And in support of this, Spain imposed restrictions on trade, very tight restrictions on ownership. As I've established, even encomiendas were not owned by the actors set up who were in charge of them. The encomiendas were owned by the state. Very tight restrictions on ownership so that the state in absolute control could benefit from economic activity. Economic participation was limited to those officials who were in charge of, say, encomiendas or the production processes that the Spaniards set up. And in general, the entire thing was set up to benefit Spain. This included a very tight stratification between elites and laborers. And of course, it involved forced labor and slavery. And in general, it meant that the stratification that was already in place in many Latin American pre-colonial civilizations was reinforced. And so we'll talk more about this in a moment and where some of these policies came from and why, for example, Spain so intensely colonized Latin America. But one thing that I'll say for now is that it colonized those places that were already the most developed in terms of their indigenous institutions. And the reason was because they could appropriate those existing institutions in service of this mercantilist policy. So let's take a look at the Spanish colonies. And I want you to notice when colonialism began in these colonies and when it concluded. And you'll notice that in most of them, it began in the 1500s. And in most of them, it ended in the 1800s. So colonialism lasted about 300 years. It's 3 centuries of institution building. You know, when you consider that in a class like this, and in political science classes more generally, we're often mainly focusing on the modern era, you know, the period since like World War II. That's a period of less than 100 years. And by comparison, colonialism was a period of 300 years just in Latin America. And so you get the sense then that that was a period that probably was very formative in terms of the institutions that were laid down and the patterns that were set in motion and how the resulting arrangements created opportunities for widespread participation in the economy or did not. And what that means in turn then is that there are a lot of legitimate questions about, you know, what the impact has been since the end of colonialism. What is the sort of social, political, and economic consequence of institutions like viceroyalties, the encomienda, mercantilist policies that concentrated power, tended to ignore, or if not completely ignored, other interests, created barriers to entry and participation and ownership. These institutions tended to work against the kinds of open society frameworks that we associate with development from the perspective of the institutional theory. And today, you can see a lot of legacies or residue of these institutions. So for instance, Latin American countries have strong presidents. And one reason is because in the post-colonial period, there was a lot of conflict. And it was a long period of state building that was punctuated by social fragmentation. No single group was powerful enough to establish control. And so for 80 or 90 years, countries tried to consolidate and build states and political systems that could support orderly government. They chose strong presidents because it was believed or it was perceived that strong presidents could establish control in the midst of this conflict. Latin America was different than many other places in the world, and so their legacies will look a little bit different. But those strong presidents, arguably, might be part of the story if we think that development has suffered because of a concentration of power in the president. Institutions in Latin America have often been argued to be unresponsive and rigid, or tending to become ossified or inflexible. And this unresponsiveness, some have attributed to this institutional legacy of bad institutions and inflexible or sort of rigid absolutist institutions that don't do a good job facilitating widespread participation. Ownership structures in the economy are very hierarchical, and there's a lot of industrial concentration. Countries like Argentina, for example, produce a lot of steel, but in the steel sector, only a few companies own most of the assets. That's would seem to be a reflection of that early path that was set, that path of high concentration of ownership in the hands of the state. Because even if you eventually privatize state assets, it's still very likely that it's going to be big companies or interests that purchase those assets. And it's going to be difficult to break up the concentration of those holdings if they were initially held by the state who had a monopoly in those sectors. There's also a lasting role for the state. In most countries in Latin America, the state remains an important actor, especially in natural resources. These countries depend on commodities disproportionately. Even countries like Chile still get most of their foreign exchange from natural resource exports. So it seems that in those places where mercantilist policies were laid down early on for the purpose of extracting natural resources, it might be hard for countries to break from that path. And indeed, it seems like that has been the case for many of them. And then, of course, there's also the resulting peripheral status. Countries that primarily export natural resources or produce natural resources, and if they historically have done so, those countries will have peripheral status, or they will, as the dependency theorists would tell us, they will be inserted in the world economy as peripheral countries who export primary commodities in exchange for finished goods from first world countries. Now, these extractive colonies are going to be very different than the settler colonies. These settler colonies are really kind of the mirror image or the opposite of the extractive colonies. So the Europeans didn't just form those mercantilist extractive utopias. They also formed their own little Europes, or neo-Europes, as they've sometimes been referred to. They settled in large numbers in some of those colonies. In extractive colonies, they did not encourage large-scale settlement. In fact, more often it was the case that they would send officials who would preside over the functioning and the operation of these systems of slave labor and extraction, and they would simply take advantage of those existing pools of labor without facilitating large-scale settlement. In the settler colonies, by contrast, they settled in large numbers, and they facilitated that by setting up representative institutions and promoting free markets and individualism, permitting private property, breaking up state power, creating checks against government power. And they were doing all of this in pursuit of freedom, fleeing feudalism and persecution in old Europe. And so they were doing this largely out of suspicion of power, not because they were trying to use power to take advantage of other places with great wealth. These settler colonies were different than the mercantilist extractive colonies because the settler colonies were founded by people who were actually suspicious of the very concentrations of power that were synonymous with the extractive mercantilist model. And so the settler colonies included Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, many others that we'll look at on a list here in a moment. But in these cases, it is true that in the United States, in Australia and elsewhere, kings appointed governors who had great power, but the kings also permitted assemblies who were elected by free property owning men. Now, the key here is that free property owning men was a narrow slice, but relatively speaking, it was different than the situation in the mercantilist extractive colonies, where absolute power and authority resided in the hands of the king or in the royalties who represented the king and duplicated the authority of the king. Land ownership was relatively widespread. So that meant that 50 to 80% of white men could vote and participate, even if white men were still themselves less than a majority of the population, given that there were also women, Indians, and slaves, and others. The important point is that there was a basis for representative government and that there was a toehold in that property owning individuals, men specifically, did have rights that stood in tension with those of the crown and the royalty that represented old Europe that they were often fleeing. And so these governors who represented the crown could veto and could jostle with the assemblies, but the assemblymen demanded more rights. And it was important that at the time in Britain, the Glorious Revolution was itself changing the political environment. And this was a moment, the Glorious Revolution, where the crown was checked and counterbalanced by the assembly, which was granted the right to authorize expenditure as a result of the Glorious Revolution. And this created a check and balance relationship between the crown and the legislature, and that is the assembly in Britain. That created the seed. It created the idea that freedom in representative government could be had, in that those rights could be demanded and invoked and created through a power struggle with the crown, represented by the governors. And so you have a very, very different situation in these settler colonies, where relatively widespread ownership of land by white men helped to support assemblies that had real power and that could be used to demand more rights, and that were responsive to changes in the political environment that created opportunities for counterbalancing the power of the royalty. Now, the political economy itself was also very, very different. It wasn't just that private ownership was a thing. It was also the case that the ownership structure was different. The units themselves were smaller. So in Latin America, remember that those big haciendas were owned by landowners and were held often by encomenderos, whose ownership would revert to the crown at the moment of the death of the encomendero. Not only was it the case that in the US, people could privately own farms, but those farms were also much, much smaller. And so there were many more property owners, and the society was much, much more pluralistic than in Latin America. And wealth was dispersed in the hands of many as opposed to in the hands of just a few. This was a really important difference because it meant that interest aggregation would be fundamentally different, and that there was a basis for a robust civil society where there would be a variety of interests and a variety of actors, quite different in form and scope than the encomenderos and hacienda owners in Latin America. As a result of all of this, political power was much more decentralized in the US and among the 13 colonies. The system was very, very different. And really, it can't be said or overstated just how sharp the contrast was. Now, granted, the US was sort of a pure example of a settler colony. Everyone was a little bit different. But still, the contrast between the US and in the Latin American cases is instructive, because they otherwise are quite similar in a lot of ways. And for example, if you compared the United States and Brazil, although that's a Portuguese colony, that would be a very good comparison because they're very similar in terms of a lot of characteristics. But there was also more to the story politically in the United States as compared to Latin America. So one important point was also that in the United States, settlers did not face large empires like the Aztecs or the Mayans or the Incas, and so they could defend themselves against Native Americans with relatively small militias. And this meant that as a result, there was less of a role for the military in politics because there was no need to create a huge standing army to defeat those enemies. And as a result of that smaller army and less of a role in politics for the military, there was a stronger civil and political society and a more robust sort of framework for civil and in social and political organization. It meant that there was a smaller state, power was more decentralized, and society was relatively well organized and stronger, even though it was more pluralistic and even though there was a wide range of property owners of various sizes. So the US is clearly an example of a settler colony, and those had liberal institutions where there was this promotion of economic participation, relatively widespread, few restrictions on ownership and trade. Although there was clearly a social stratification, it was a market-based social stratification that emerged based on a logic of market participation. There was the formation of a capitalist elite around holdings, mainly farms and agricultural units that were relatively small compared to the haciendas in Latin America. And all of this was oriented around promoting comparative advantages in investments that would be the most efficient and that could help to promote returns in long-term growth, mainly in these types of colonies. And they were very different than in that respect as compared to the mercantilist ones. So I showed you a moment ago the Spanish colonies, the extractive colonies. The settler colonies are the following, and we're looking at the British colonies. So these are countries that were colonized by Britain, and we've got the starting point and then the end point. These are all approximations. But one thing that you'll notice is that, well, actually, I want to pause and I want to give you a chance to look at this, and I want you to think about what's similar and what's different. In what ways are the British colonies different than the Spanish colonies, apart from the difference between extractive and liberal institutions? Do you see any other differences? I see one big difference that might be really important. Again, the question is, in what way were the settler colonies different based on the information that we're looking here? So Rady says location differences for sure. Spanish colonies started in the 1500s. Yeah. So mercantilism and extractive policies really had their heyday between like the 1500s and like the 1800s. It was that earlier period when mercantilist policies were most widespread. Karen points out that there are more British colonies. This is true. Anna says colonialism lasted longer. I don't know, though. I don't know if that's true, because remember that in most of the Spanish colonies, colonialism lasted about 300 years. I don't know if that's the case if that was the case for most of these, I think that colonialism would still be going on because most of these colonies started in the 1800s. So I think that based on this information, I think that colonialism lasted in most cases. There obviously are some exceptions. In most of these cases, colonialism was more brief in comparison to the Spanish colonies. But the point that Rady made about the timing is probably really important because remember that so far we've differentiated between the British and the Spanish colonies based on the type of institutions. We know that the Spanish colonies had extractive ones, the British ones mainly had liberal ones. And I also told you that the mercantilist extractive policies were most common during the period from 1500 to about 1800. Well, what that meant was that the more liberal policies were really in vogue around the same time that Britain really intensified its colonialism and really reached its crescendo in terms of its colonialism. And so what you see then is you see the timing and the history playing in, and that's why most of these British colonies, if not all of them, had liberal institutions. So the big question for us in this class is development, right? You know, what's the point of all this history? How do these distant founding events or initial moments or these moments of colonialism, how do they impact development? That's the key question. And so we're going to look at that now, and we're going to take a look at the data. We're going to look first at Spanish colonies. That's what we have here. And we're looking at HDI from 1975 and then HDI from 2000. Remember that HDI is our Human Development Index indicator. Higher coefficients indicate higher levels of human development. Human development accounts for social and economic advances that include advances in income, but also literacy and education rates, and some health indicators as well. You can see that there are some changes between 1975 and 2000. There are some important differences between the less developed and the more developed countries in this sample. The most developed Spanish colonies or former Spanish colonies included Argentina, which had 0.84, Uruguay, which had 0.83, Mexico, which had 0.80, Cuba, 0.80, Costa Rica, Chile, Venezuela. You notice that that's relatively good, right? I would say that that places most of these countries between, say, an intermediate and a higher development outcome. Let's take a look now at the settler colonies. You'll notice that, interestingly, the highest coefficients rank the highest developers in this set above the highest developers in the Spanish colonies set that we just looked at. So for instance, Singapore, the United States, Trinidad and Tobago, the Bahamas, Australia, Canada, Brunei, Cyprus, Hong Kong, New Zealand. These are countries that rank very high on the Human Development Index, 0.90 or higher. But notice that there's also a lot of noise, right? There are a lot of countries that have very, very low coefficients. You'll notice that there's a pattern here. The countries that score the lowest are disproportionately in Africa. It's the British colonies that are in Africa. Why might that be? Well, they decolonized in the 1950s and 60s. And so most of these late bloomers are exactly that. They're late bloomers. You know, we don't have enough time to really see where they'll go. But it's possible that they'll develop further in subsequent decades. But what I want you to notice is that there's just a lot of variation. The data set for the Spanish colonies is more consistent. It's basically between about 0.70 and 0.85. This data set is much, much more varied in terms of the HDI coefficients. And so I don't know if it's actually as settled as the literature sometimes suggests, that British colonies are just disproportionately better off. But there's an important question that comes up here. It's a question that Acemoglu and Robinson can't answer. And that is, why did some extractive colonies do worse than others? That is to say, if all we're doing is distinguishing between extractive colonies and inclusive or liberal colonies, well, why is it that some extractive colonies did much, much better than others, and some extractive colonies did far worse than others? How do we understand variation within Spanish and British colonies? Now, this is a key question because look, notice that there is still a substantial difference between Argentina and Bolivia, or between Argentina and, say, Mexico, or I guess, no, that's not that big. Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Honduras. Does anyone have any ideas? How can we explain why some extractive colonies did better or worse than others? Any ideas? It would have to be, well, using our method of difference, right? It would have to be that the Spanish colonies differed in some important variable, right? That even though they were all extractive colonies, they differed in some key way that stands outside of the model developed by Acemoglu and Robinson that just differentiates between extractive and liberal institutions. Does anyone have any ideas about what that other factor might be that might differentiate Spanish colonies from each other? Karen says, can the size of the countries matter in the population differences? Yes, absolutely. So Karen, what would your hunch be? Do you think that the bigger the country or the bigger the territory, the more it might have been colonized by Spain? Is that your hunch? Tell us in the chat. Alondra says, it can be because of geographic locations, such as climate affecting livestock or crops. How come water is amount of people? How close water is amount of people? Certainly. So some of those do matter, without a doubt. And Rady says maybe the amount of resources. Touche. One of those resources might be labor, right? And as many people have mentioned already, Karen as well as Alondra, the amount of laborers available or the human capital that exists already. This is part of the story. Yeah. Any other ideas? It's a really interesting thing because Acemoglu and Robinson can't help us with this question. They just can't. Their theory is not flexible enough. So we've had some really good responses, and you're basically on point already. And so I'm going to go ahead and tell you what we know, or what the research suggests, is that, first of all, some Spanish colonies were more heavily colonized than others. So Spain did not set up extractive institutions to the same degree in every single territory. It colonized some places more extensively than it did others. And not just a little, like a lot, a substantial amount. So notice this right here, this column right here, level of colonialism. Places like Bolivia, Spain colonized extensively. But places like Argentina, Spain did not colonize extensively. Low levels of colonialism in places like Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Uruguay. High levels of colonialism in Bolivia, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, etc. So what that meant is that Spain engaged in much more institution building and setup in places like Bolivia and Guatemala than they did in places like Argentina and Chile. Well, then the question becomes, okay, well, if they extensively colonized some places but not others, and if those places that were extensively colonized were the ones that developed the least, why did they extensively colonize some places and not others? Well, the reason had to do with how extensively the indigenous society had already developed that place in terms of building their own indigenous institutions, setting up their own systems of stratification, etc. Places that were very developed in terms of the indigenous society, like Mexico, Peru, modern day Bolivia, modern day Guatemala, places where the Aztecs and the Incas and the Mayan people were very strong and robust and had very robust civilizations. Those were the same places that Spain took the most advantage of colonization wise. Why? Why would they take the most advantage of those places where the indigenous had already engaged in the most extensive society building? Well, it was because that way they could appropriate existing institutions. Think about it. If your objective is to just take everything and channel all the wealth back home, well, it makes sense to go to those places that already have the most established civilizations, because you can just take control of their systems, hijack them, and harness them so that you can channel the money, the profit, the wealth back home. Those places that were not well developed and that did not have extensive indigenous societies were also those places that didn't have extensive or had less extensive mineral and material resources. And so there was a sort of human and kind of capital component in the sense that Spain took advantage of the places that had the most, so to speak, already. And so what Acemoglu and Robinson can't tell us is why some Spanish colonies did better than others and why some Spanish colonies did worse than others. There's an important part of the story, and that is the level of colonialism and then the level of pre-colonial development. So notice, just to kind of summarize what I've told you, the places with the highest human development index coefficient are also the places that were the least colonized. The places that were the least colonized are also the places that were the least developed in terms of the pre-colonial indigenous society. Those places that have the lowest human development index coefficients are also those places that were least colonized in that had the lowest level of pre-colonial indigenous development. Excuse me, that also had the highest level of pre-colonial development. Listen, everybody, we're out of time. We'll finish this up on Wednesday as we get started with our next unit. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you on Wednesday. Of course, Ernie. Thanks, Alondra. Thanks, Walter. What's up, Ernie?
I had a question in regards to the problem set.
Okay.
When are you planning to like grade it? Because I haven't gotten any grade yet for it.
It was due on Friday. Today's Monday.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought it was a while ago. It seemed like.
No, when did you turn it in?
Oh, I turned it on the day of. Yeah, because like I know people in the class already had it graded. That's why. That's how I was wondering.
Okay, so I have a teaching assistant. So